What's up, dude?
How's it going?
Bro, we're back in the studio again, this time for our first book club. Since we've moved, obviously, we apologize to everybody if you're big fans of the book club. It's been a while since we've done it, but we're back in full swing. We're in our studio. We're going to be slowly but surely over time getting our audio bugs fixed.
Yep.
Maybe add a camera in here eventually that'll have both me and Gavin in the same shot, all that kind of fun stuff. We're getting it worked out. But yeah, we're super excited to be back plowing into some Chris Hedges, Wages of Rebellion. Today, we're going to be talking about chapters 2 and 3. If you're following along, we covered the introduction in chapter 1 a few weeks ago on the episode. So if you guys are interested, make sure and go check that out. But yeah, so far I've been really digging the book. Chris Hedges was actually the catalyst in a weird way for us starting the book club after I heard him kind of chatting about how he thinks that, internet leftists should really return to text more than we have. And so Gavin and I took that as a challenge to go ahead and incorporate that into our show. And, I think it's been successful. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, we're really
more engaging to dissect these in a group.
Yeah, it's been super fun. And this is really a great book to go through together. Truly a radical read for you guys. Just a really meaty book full of good themes for leftists to discuss. So we're really enjoying going through it. We hope you guys are too, or at least listening to us talk about it. And yeah, as Zach said, we're going to be doing these on a more consistent basis. We're going to try to put out episodes every Thursday early for patrons. And then a few days later, maybe 2-3 days later, by Sunday, perhaps, the episode will come out for everyone. But yeah, patrons obviously get to see these first. So the link is in the description if you'd like to join.
Yeah, but I guess without further ado, basically the way we structure these book clubs is Gavin and I, we read the book and we pull out some of our favorite quotes, some things that we think will be a good conversation starter, some of the elements that we think really embody the idea, the critical ideas of the chapter. So the first chapter we're going to be discussing today is chapter 2, and he calls it the post-constitutional era. So if we just go ahead and pull up our first quote of the day, there's a little bit of a background to this. I wanted to talk about it because I wasn't familiar with this woman, but the Hedges actually interviews a former attorney that was disbarred after she represented what's his name, Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, who was accused of terrorism and locked in prison under special administration, special administrative measures. It's known as SAMs. That's what they're going to lock up Julian Assange with if they ever get him on U.S. soil. Which forces an individual into solitary confinement and does not permit them to communicate with a single soul besides their attorney. So this is super fucked up. So what happened was she basically, on behalf of her client, she released a public statement from him, and that got her disbarred, and it actually also got her thrown in jail as well. But one of the places I thought would be interesting to start would be, she says, Hedges writes that when Lynn Stewart, this woman and a civil rights attorney, started practicing law in the 1970s, she said it was the golden era in which a series of legal decisions, including rulings that affected police lineups and the information and evidence that the government had to turn over to defendants on trials, created a chance for a fair defense. But these legal advances were steadily reversed, she said, in a string of court decisions that, especially after 9/11, made the state omnipotent. As citizens were stripped of power, she said, the bar experienced a death of the spirit. Lawyers gave up. They no longer saw defending people accused of crime as a calling, something that you did because you were answering a higher voice. And I think that this kind of represents the real fucking shitty spot that we're in American politics right now, and also just in Americans as people who we're all subject to this, absurd system of justice. And as we'll get into later, that affects certain communities more than others, but certainly we're all subject to this legal prosecution in this tyrannical state that is seizing basically all of our last weapons to defend ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that Chris Hedges, who's written a lot about the dying empire and the fading of American prominence on the world stage, I think part of his reason for identifying the problem as such is because he's seen the erosion over the years of rights in America, of legal precedents and everything that have been overturned, especially in the wake of 9/11. Something he writes a lot about is the erosion of civil liberties that Edward Snowden eventually exposed. So yeah, I certainly think that he's correct here, and a very interesting observation.
Yeah, the next quote that I just wanted to add on because I think it flows well is, after 9/11, the playing field suddenly changed and everything favored the prosecution, certainly in federal cases, Stewart said. And as you mentioned, Edward Snowden is the perfect example of this. He, cannot raise any of the evidence for justification as to why he did this. He cannot raise any, should he come back to America. People always like to say, Edward Snowden, if he didn't do anything wrong, why doesn't he just come back to America? It's because he cannot get a fair trial here. Not in a sense like, oh, it's going to be a sham politics trial. He literally, by the numbers, is not able to bring any evidence against the government, basically, because all the information is classified. He's not even the government isn't supposed to even recognize that it's real. They do all these kinds of horse shit to escape actually having to engage in court in a battle where they lose, basically, right? Because that's the government embarrasses itself all the time, but it really tries to maintain this theater of righteousness and high level morality. People still to this day, regardless of all of the things that are being written here, they still really trust and believe in the justice system. A lot of people believe in America as like a land of the free where everybody gets a free trial. And obviously that's a sham. And we'll talk about how that is beginning to crumble. But yeah, she goes on and says there's no level playing field anymore. It was like if you were the last guy standing and you had to keep them from making a goal. You're at the 6-inch line trying to do it. It was impossible to stop them. They controlled it. They controlled what the charges were. They determined whether the corporation is worthy and everybody must cooperate. And it changed into a very different system, certainly on the federal level. And one of the things you just observed, Gavin, is you've talked about how likely one of the reasons that Hedges is so prescient on these matters and able to observe them is because he's been at this game for a long time. He remembers the 70s when, this woman is describing as the golden age of, legal activism, essentially, and legal victories in that field. But what's interesting is that's kind of the exact opposite approach of one of, I would consider, Hedges' intellectual peers, Chomsky, who seems to have, actually deepened his trust in institutions as if it's the only way out. And obviously, you and I tend to think that that's the wrong approach. But I'm just wondering why you think some people who have been dissidents their whole lives later on just kind of get enraptured into the blanket of, oh, this is our only way out. We have to use the powers that be. Whereas others, just walk the line permanently.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think ultimately it just depends on whether or not you end up being more of an optimistic kind of person or a pessimistic person when it comes to the prospect of revolt, even nonviolent, violent revolt, regardless. And ultimately, I believe some people, such as Chomsky, perhaps in their old age, have decided quite cynically that that simply isn't possible because it hasn't succeeded in their lifetime, in their experience. Therefore, we must resort to the traditional means. And that is a pretty defeatist outlook, but according to some people, perhaps the more realistic one. Again, that's not my position, but perhaps that is Chomsky's. Others, like Hedges, have observed that the crumbling of the system over time requires an act of revolt. And while Chomsky may not disagree with that, it may just vary to which degree they prescribe the revolt's intensity.
Yeah, definitely. I think that that's fair. I just think that. I don't know. The more shocked that I get as an individual, the more I repelled and, the more odious acts of our government become apparent to me, the more I am just dissuaded from participating in the system at all. And it always baffles me the number of people that I find respectable who have had long careers as intellectuals that I don't want to say revere because that's, not the correct term, but really have been inspired, and obviously I still, tremendous respect for a lot of these people, but I just think that it's a problem that needs to be more fully investigated because we can't have all of our leading dissidents deciding that, once they are of their most clout, once they reach that upper echelon, that we need to submit to the powers that be, that we need to, that the AOC is our best shot when she's, not doing anything and that criticizing her is detrimental for some reason, etc.
Absolutely.
But I guess we can move on to the next quote because this is an interesting development. So Lynn Stewart was, as we mentioned, she was completely disbarred because she released a statement from her client. That was all it took. She released a statement to the public from a imprisoned person. Anybody should have the right to be able to communicate through their attorney, at least to the public. This is obvious, I feel, but this is why she was absurdly brought to trial and then later imprisoned. But she says in her own trial, the government presented audio recordings of her meeting with Abdel Rahman, who was the man accused of terrorist activities. There was, but she says in the prison in Rochester, Minnesota, the taping of that conversation before the Federal Patriot Act would have violated attorney-client privilege, but now such tapings are legal. And this is just a clear example of the United States bending the rules, changing our constitutional liberties in order to meet their new desire to control us and spy on us, essentially, violating our rights.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that Chris Hedges talks about a lot in this chapter is the erosion of civil rights in the wake of 9/11. And he quite powerfully recounts just how dramatically they were eroded, just how much the Constitution and our foundational documents were ignored and overridden by a government that was hell-bent on expanding its powers to surveil and control its populace. And yeah, it's really pretty bleak, the way he describes the trajectory that not only we've experienced so far, but that we will continue down.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at even just Gavin and I's lifetime, right? We were both born in 98. You have the, just years later, you have the internet bubble burst. Then you have the 2008 housing crisis. And then you have COVID-19's economic burst, right? So this is, Gavin and I are 23. That's 3 fucking huge cataclysmic economic disasters, right? Gavin fucking graduated college into probably the worst job market ever.
Yeah.
But so it's just like this is only compounding, right? So young people are at an interesting crossroads because, if there were no opportunities for millennials, there's certainly no opportunities for Gen Z because you have 45-year-olds who have never gotten their shot and their resumes are going up against yours as a fucking 23-year-old trying to get a entry-level position. Yeah. This is the world we've created. So, and on top of all of that, you have the massive expansion of tyranny of the government.
Right. And on top of that, you have the massive expansion of the digital economy and the, digitization of literally everything, which is in some respects unprecedented as far as the different, protections we have as far as civil liberties go. So there's kind of these new areas, these new gray areas, which government, NSA, et cetera, is able to exploit because, metadata and all this kind of stuff is somewhat new to the conversation, but it obviously should be treated no differently when it comes to things like search and seizure and our supposed protection from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you go to the next quote, here, she says, we have this facade she said that we have this constitution that we respect and that we rely on and that we can embrace, and you can't do that. That's my constitutional rights, etc. When in reality, she says it's a puff of smoke. And I think that that's really true. And a lot of people realize that it's soon. And I think that the George Floyd protests were a big wake up for a lot of people in that, when you saw just how draconian and tyrannical and just straight up fascistic the fucking impulses are of so many people in power in this country, right? One of the most disgusting fucking things was happening when people were literally calling for the U.S. military to use force against protesters on U.S. soil. This is unfucking acceptable, guys. We already have a militarized police presence. That wasn't even good enough for these people. And then you realize that you're going to immediately be labeled a terrorist for peacefully protesting because, there's going to be, instigators, people who come to just cause a ruckus to invalidate whatever peaceful protest movement you're doing. And, obviously people are pissed off at a dramatic injustice. So people are going to be, breaking shit. That's just human nature. Sorry if you can't fucking live with it. I'd rather have property destroyed than human beings. In George Floyd, we were literally gassed. Everybody that was there protesting, I imagine most people listening to this podcast participated. It swept the whole fucking nation wherever you were. People were submitted to literal chemical weapons attacks, gas attacks from, tear gas is a chemical weapon, guys. They were deploying that on, their own citizens for peacefully gathering. And the case of Kansas City around the plaza, which is a a really affluent area, just mobs of people, and they didn't care. They turned it into a fucking war zone. And it was like that all over the country. Places like Seattle, Portland, Oregon, New York City had all these episodes. They're willing to just completely abandon any kind of constitutional rights that we're supposed to have. And now they have the legal backup to do that.
Yep, absolutely.
She says here that the courts were the last institution that liberal reformers had faith in before they too fell victim to the demands of corporate power. And now there are no institutions left that provide citizens with a voice. And that's basically where we're at.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris talks a lot too about the increased militarization of the police force around the country and the normalization of that fact, and just how scary it is that essentially we do have an occupying force of militarized police. I think he calls it a quasi-occupational force at one point, which is just very accurate. And he cites the massive increase in SWAT raids over the years, going from 3,000 in 1980s to now somewhere like 80,000 a year. That's pretty insane if you think about it, but it's been totally normalized and no one talks about it. So yeah, it's pretty scary stuff.
Yeah, in the bulk of the SWAT raids, he talks about how those are, they're not, there's an active shooter hostage situation. It's like, no, we're investigating a criminal, and probably they're linked to drugs and the war on drugs, etc. But I think this chapter serves as a really good backdrop for what he wants to get into in the next chapter, which he calls the Invisible Revolution. And I think it's important to talk about all of this is because this is what's setting the stage, right? This is the crumbling of all of the mythology of America before people's eyes. You have the multiple financial catastrophes, like we've said, 3 in Gavin and I's relatively short lifetime in the grand scheme of things. But on top of that, you also have the stripping of people's constitutional rights. You have the Edward Snowden leaks, which showed people that the government was spying on them illegally. You have the Assange trial, so you can see a full-on assault on the free press of America. This is what happens when you expose the actual crimes of the United States government. This is what happens when you see that they, are committing war crimes out in broad daylight overseas, right? That's what our taxpayer dollars are funding. The United States has to crack down on that. As a government, they have to crack down on whatever, right? But now in his next chapter, he's talking about the result of that, the byproduct of that, which is what he predicts is an inevitable revolution, even though the rumblings of it have yet to, surface themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
So he says revolutions, when they begin, are invisible, at least to the wider society. They start with the slow discrediting and dismantling of an old ideology and an old language used to interpret reality and justify power. Human societies are captive to and controlled by language. When the old ideas are shattered, when it's clear the official words and ideas no longer match the reality, the institutions that buttress the ruling class deflate and collapse. I guess, do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think that's I guess Chris Hedges seemingly thinks that this is fast approaching. Other people are a lot more pessimistic on that. I'm just wondering, where in that process do you think we are now?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's somewhat of a slow collapse for sure. But I certainly think it's true that when the old ideas are shattered, it's clear that the official words and ideas no longer match the reality, as he says. So I think it's absolutely accurate what he's talking about. And just in general, the crumbling of the civil liberties, I think, is definitely a sign of, this kind of festering dissatisfaction among society with these institutions, which have been long accepted. So, I think that it's kind of like a slow disillusionment, which we see taking place, like I said, almost in slow motion, as people both wake up to, but also further entrench themselves in the denial.
Yeah. It's kind of the tale of two Americas in that sense. If you go to the next quote, he says, the vast levels of poverty undermines the myth of American prosperity, which is what we're all taught from a young age, right? We basically pray to the flag as youngins. Americans are the greatest country in the world. We're the most prosperous country in the world. We have the most. We do the most. We invented the most, etc. The truths are dimly apparent, but we have yet to sever ourselves from the old way of speaking and formulate a new language to explain us to ourselves. So we're still using all of this language that's steeped in mythology. All of this manifest destiny kind of goggles on our mind. America is the greatest country in the world, and anything else that would compromise that is not true. It's you have such tunnel vision, and it's really weird actually. Movies have satirized it really well. The shambles of the realities of America versus the
Right.
diehard belief in it. Like you just watch Borat or something. But anyway, he says until this happens, the corporate state can harness the old language like a weapon and employ the institutions of power and organs of state security to perpetuate itself. So until we say no, enough of this, the state power organisms, the oppressors are completely invalid. They no longer have our submission. They do not have a monopoly on power. That's the only way to liberate ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also ironic that institutions which are clung to by the people, these institutions of old and the institutions of power, they're discarded at will conveniently by the state, by the people in power. The Constitution, for example, which is still upheld, is this document which we have to follow, despite the fact that it was written all of these years ago. Same with the Declaration of Independence and all of these founding documents. We're told and taught that they're almost holy in a sense, and that we have to stick to them at all costs. We can't edit them unless we go through this, process of amending. But then the state will willfully, conveniently discard and ignore what those documents say when it's convenient for them.
Yeah, and they just rely on like a bullshit, like, oh, well, one, they'll make everything top secret, and then they'll give the most like ludicrous interpretation of the Constitution imaginable. And then when that's not good enough, they'll pass a bunch of laws that say that this thing is exempt from constitutional scrutiny. Essentially, it's like, oh, if you're a terrorist, we can extrajudicially kill you or imprison you eternally without trial. There's no habeas corpus, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
But anyway, if we want to go to the next quote, this is essentially the crux of the chapter, right? He talks about the revolutionary theorists of the past invested tremendous energy in looking for the triggers of revolt, although nearly all were caught off guard by the eruption of the revolutions they championed and organized. And it's because, you just can't predict something like that. I don't want to there's a who's that economist guy that's always talking about black swans, Nicholas Taleb. It's almost like a legitimate black swan event, to borrow from the capitalists. It's an unpredictable fucking thing that just will emerge, and you have to just kind of accept it when it comes. And he talks about how I can't remember. At some point, he quotes somebody that compares it to like a kettle picking up steam. It just kind of takes a while. All you can do is, make the fire stronger, basically.
Right.
So I think that that's it's pretty accurate, I guess, is what I'll say.
I think that's accurate. I think it just goes to show that when it comes to revolt and when it comes to revolutionary kind of actions and organizations, I think the demands and the what is desired needs to be very clearly set from the beginning. It can't be disorganized, or else, it could just erupt into chaos.
Yeah, exactly. And he quotes actually next in this, and I pulled it, Peter Krapotkin, who most people probably know from his anarchist essay, The Conquest of Bread, but well-known Russian social anarchist, really pretty influential writer. He writes, after a long period of slumber comes a moment of awakening. Then thought frees herself from the chains with which those interested rulers, lawyers, clerics have carefully enwound her. She shatters the chains. She subjects to severe criticism all that has been taught to her and lays bare the emptiness of the religious, political, legal, and societal prejudices amid which she has vegetated. She starts to research in new paths, enriches our knowledge with new discoveries, and creates new sciences. But the inveterate enemies of thought, the government, the lawgiver, and the priest, soon recover from their defeat. By degrees, they gather together their scattered forces and remodel their faith and their code of laws to adapt them to new needs. This is what is happening right now with the LGBTQ flag on fucking bombers in Syria, or we have a woman that is now, doing this horrible, atrocious act of militarism that it was normally a rule for men, or etc. Putting a sheen on something to make it more salient to the public, right? So people right now are raising a ruckus about obviously for good reason, institutional racism. That's one of the things that, people on the left like me and Gavin are, I would say correctly raising hell about it. And, we could be raising more hell about it. But in order to combat that, in order to undermine true progress that would actually liberate people, they will instead, prioritize having, a black CEO who is going to continue to perpetuate all of the economic systems that, keep those communities from thriving in the way they should in America.
Yeah, and it's very possible that it's Chris Hedges' understanding of this, which has led to him being one of the best and most virulent critics of the Democratic Party, which obviously loves to engage in this sort of identity politics in order to distract from their quite heinous policy, especially when it comes to foreign policy and, things like that. So, yeah, Chris Hedges is absolutely correct in that sense. And this is a great quote from Peter
Krapotkin. Yeah. But this is an interesting, the follow-up quote. And I wanted to end this chapter with a series of quotes from individuals that he cites throughout the book that kind of have a competing understanding of whether or not the proletariat is going to be able to uplift themselves, or if they have, as Marx and Emma Goldman clearly have here in this quote, a pessimistic stance of whether, the masses are willing to participate. Marx called them the lumpen proletariat. Emma Goldman called them the mass, but she says the mass clings to its masters, loves the whip, and is the first to cry, crucify. And my question for you, Gavin, is do you think this is true? And as populists, how do we square that circle?
Yeah, I think unfortunately this is a large part of human nature that simply can't be ignored, and we do have to figure out a way to grapple with it, I suppose. Although you're right, as populist, I'm definitely not in the interest of authoritarianism or totalitarianism. I think we need to balance the best interests of people with everyone's right to live how they wish. So, that's definitely an interesting concept. But ultimately, yeah, I do think that this is a tendency which rears its head in people, and not just on the right. And not just on the left, but just in human nature in general.
Yeah. Do you ever see the Almodovar film, Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down?
I don't believe I've seen that one.
It's got Antonio Banderas in it, and for anybody in the audience, you should check it out. But it's a really interesting exploration into Stockholm syndrome. I feel like many Americans suffer with systemic Stockholm syndrome of the U.S. government. We're in a fucking abusive ass relationship with our government, guys, and we need to get out of it. I just think that we've somehow fallen in love with our captors, and I think that's why we rest.
Yeah, I mean that certainly might be part of it. I certainly think also it's just the human tendency to defend one's team, or that human tendency to be patriotic or jingoistic that transcends nations. Even if you go to a place like France,
it's
for
the pack
example,
mentality.
People are nationalistic and patriotic and jingoistic pretty much regardless of where they live. At least that's what I've experienced. I mean, not everyone, of course, but there's always going to be that faction of the population that defends its state at all costs, that defends its leader at all costs. And only in extreme cases will they admit when their country or their government truly fucks up. So, I think it's almost more of a human nature thing, but I certainly think that the Stockholm syndrome theory is valid as well.
Yeah, and I guess my follow up to that would be: do you think there are effective means to combat that? Because I do feel like the sheer being confronted by, and this isn't something I guess that we can do, it's more the state doing it to itself, but as Chris Hedges notes, being confronted by reality that is so different than what you've been told, kind of like have your moment of stepping out of the Platonic cave, if you will, right? If you are being fed this mythology, but you're living in a world where that just completely doesn't match. I think slowly over time that'll be appealing to fewer and fewer people, and only the people who are just the most deeply entrenched in the mythology. Typically, I would imagine an older population, people who still remember a better time in America when it was easier for their demographic to succeed. Right, I'm thinking of my grandparents, who still really believe in like small business ownership and all that kind of shit is possible, because in the 70s, obviously my grandpa was had the opportunity to have a small business, right? That was, obviously not everybody did, but far more people 50 years ago had an opportunity to open a small business and run it and live a good life and be their own boss and be an entrepreneur than they do now. And I think that people who had those positive experiences in the United States are going to be the last ones. So you can probably transition. Whereas younger people like us who do not know anything other than a fucking broken system, who have had leaders like Bernie Sanders expose us to the hollowness from a young age, might be, better places to start with, like, unraveling the onion.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, ultimately it comes down to the people that are in privilege at any given time are going to ignore the realities of those that are not in privilege. I mean, just like how in the 1950s, the, white working class, which was able to succeed in large part, probably denied the conditions of the black working class, which in many cases was not allowed to succeed in the same way. Nowadays, we see the, rich and most privileged people, still trying to uphold the pull yourself up by the bootstraps, rugged individuality mindset, despite the fact that they had a leg up from the beginning, despite the fact that in many cases, they were born with a silver spoon in their mouth, and they don't believe that other people, poor people, should be afforded the same opportunities and all that. So, I think that's part of it too. It's just that every generation, regardless of whether or not conditions get better or worse, there's always going to be that imbalance. And, I think the only way to really combat that is just to increase solidarity among all classes. And as Chris Hedges talks about in this book too, things like fighting for a higher minimum wage can do a lot to equalize the classes, because if, the lower class, quote unquote, is making a more similar amount of money to the children of privilege, essentially, then it kind of makes them on the same team, and they can unite against the actual common enemy, which is the real bourgeois, the real 1%. But until that happens, there is going to be that class war, and there is going to always be that human nature which kicks in, which causes the more privileged among us to look down on the less privileged. And again, maybe just out of pure human nature, uphold this idea of a meritocracy, because a lot of people feel like, that without upholding that idea, then they feel like their own success is invalid, and they don't want to admit that they might have been the result of a privileged environment rather than their own brilliance and talent.
Yeah, and I think that also happens for people who come from a more of a modest background or a low income background, and then they're able to create success for themselves.
Yeah,
they want to feel like they did it, and anybody can do it, and etc. And the one last quote I had from Hedges, we don't have to put it up, it's really short. He just says, the urban poor are already in chains. These chains are being readied for the rest of us. I think that's, perfectly succinct, but it just really reminded me of actually a line that LP has from Run the Jewels' most recent record. It's a track called Walking in the... But he says, funny fact about a cage, they're never built for just one group. So when the cage is done with them and you're still poor, they'll come for you. The newest, lowest on the totem, well, golly gee, you've just been used. You help fuel the death machine that down the line will kill you too. Essentially being like a call out to these white, working class individuals, who may have supported, Donald Trump or these other, or mass incarceration at some point. He's observing that, hey, once they've filled up the prisons with those individuals, they're going to change the laws. And now you're going to be the new lowest on the totem, who's, they're going to come for. So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Chris Hedges, again, really eloquently, but also quite hauntingly describes kind of the encroaching nature of the totalitarianism that we're seeing, especially in the 2000s era, especially after 9/11. But how, once this trend starts, it doesn't usually stop. And hence the imperative, the moral imperative of revolt, which is the theme of this book, and something we're looking forward to continuing exploring in the next chapter and episode of this book club, unless you have anything else to add, Zach.
No, that's a good place to wrap, I think. But yeah, good stuff. Really enjoying the book. Bear with us as we continue to make our studio look even better, sound even better. Thanks for tuning in, guys.
Yeah, and again, episodes drop early for patrons on Thursdays and a couple days later for everyone else. So enjoy